Motion blur is an essential element with any graphics or visual effects if you want a smooth and organic feel. As with everything, there is sometimes that you do want a choppy feel, but more often than not, when the movement in your graphic is feeling wrong, it's probably the lack of motion blur. So today we're going to be looking at a few ways to add that into your project. So here we have a graphic sliding in from the left, but as is, it feels a bit stiff. So we will drop on the transform effect, bump the shutter to 180, and add our position keyframes here. And as simple as that, we added motion blur to our image. Now you can right-click the keyframes and add an ease in and out, and your movement should be much smoother. For a more controlled movement, you can expand the position options by clicking this down arrow here and adjusting the ease velocity to your liking. Using the transform effect should cover most situations where you would want motion blur. However, there are times where that might not be the best option. For example, we have added a speed ramp to this clip, and if we were to add the transform effect with the high shutter angle, there will be no blur applied because we're not creating any motion keyframes for any of these parameters. The best case for this scenario is a third-party plugin called Real Smart Motion Blur. You drop that on and it assesses the movement in your shot and adds blur accordingly. But if you don't have that plugin, we could go with a directional blur. Since our footage here is moving from left to right, we will set our direction to 90 degrees so that we have some horizontal blur. Now add a keyframe set to 0 at the beginning, move a few frames forward, and raise it to your desired blur amount. Then go to the end of the speed ramp and set the blur amount to 0. Move a few frames back and raise the blur amount to whatever you set it at previously. You can add an ease to the keyframes and dial that further if you would like, but now you should have a more smooth speed ramp effect. If you have motion that is moving in or out instead of right to left, we can move over to After Effects, which should be included in your Creative Cloud subscription. Right-click the clip, then select Replace with After Effects Composition, and inside of After Effects, we're going to go to Effects, Blur and Sharpen, and drop on CC Radial Blur. Change the type to zoom, set the center of the effect wherever your subject is, then set your keyframes for the amount. Start with 0, move a few frames forward, and bump up the blur to whatever you would like. Move closer to the end, add another keyframe set to that same last value, then at the end of the ramp, send it back down to 0, and you should now have this. If you want an area of the image to remain unaffected, you can create a mask by holding down this rectangle tool and clicking the ellipse tool. Mask the area you want to keep, open your mask, and then click the inverted box. Open your effect, and click this plus sign next to the compositing options. The radial blur will now use the mask you created as its reference, so you can feather out your mask, and you now have this clean motion blur. Another great tool inside of After Effects is Pixel Motion Blur. This effect will automatically add motion blur to your footage. Just drop in the effect, raise your shutter sample to around 10 or 15 to avoid any artifacts, and you've now added motion blur to your clip. It is a heavy effect, so expect your computer to have slow processing times, but it gets the job done. This works great for speed ramps and can also be used to smooth out any stop motion animation. Now, all of this is assuming that you are using a shot that has its motion baked in. Of course, if you've animated something inside of After Effects, like a text or graphic that you've keyframe the position of, all you have to do is turn on motion blur here and you have it. Now After Effects will force motion blur on your layer relative to its speed and direction. And if you need, you can come into your composition settings and shift your shutter angle to increase or decrease that blur amount. Just like a camera, the higher number gives you more motion blur and the lower number gives you less. But there you have it, a handful of ways to add motion blur to your projects. If you have something that you'd like to see us cover, feel free to drop us a comment below. And subscribe to the channel for more tutorials and updates like this one, because ants don't have lungs. Did you know that?